All right, everyone, welcome back to Financial Clarity for Doctors. I'm Corey Janoff, joined as always by Rachelle Vanderzanden.
I'm here too.
There we go. And some of you, well, we know some of you are because we talk to you daily, but some of you might be anxious or concerned about your job or income stability, given some of the recent news headlines and proposals from the White House. And when we say recent, we're recording this on April 2nd, so you may not hear it until the end of April or even May. And the headlines might be different. Things could have changed between now and then. But based on what we've gotten in the first quarter of this year, that some of you have some concerns, like, will federal employees have jobs later this year? Are grants being potentially canceled? Some have been. Future grant funding, is in limbo. Is Medicare or Medicaid funding being cut? What about CDC or NIH funding? Are hospitals and universities going to lose their nonprofit status? How does this potentially affect me, my job, my income, my student loan forgiveness plans, et cetera? So there's kind of a lot up in the air right now that we don't really have answers to, but we can speculate a little bit on how it potentially could impact you and things you might, be able to do ahead of time to make sure it doesn't impair your financial objectives.
Yep. I think one big caveat when we talk about like job insecurity and things like that is that keep in mind that doctors and other medical professionals generally have a lot better job security than people in other industries. So we're not recording this to make you more scared about things that are happening in the economy and with the federal government. That is not the intent at all. It's just like, here are some things to consider. Here are some ways that you can be prepared if you are already scared so that you can be less scared. Like a lot of financial planning is about just making sure that we have a backup plan in place so that if something bad happens financially, we're still okay and we can do that and we can make preparations like that.
And the reason
Um,
we cover topics like this or any other topic we've ever recorded is it's often brought up by clients. Like, you guys ask us these
mhm.
questions in meetings, and if we get more than one client asking us a question about something, odds are a lot of you might have that question or concern. And that's where we'll
Mhm.
maybe say, let's record an episode on the
Mhm.
subject, even if Rochelle and I aren't necessarily experts in this particular arena.
Yeah, it's worth having a conversation and just, always do your own research, especially about your own particular job if you're really concerned about your job. I know Corey mentioned that we've had lots of clients come to us with concerns about the economy or their jobs or their federal government. I think this can be especially true for people that are doing a lot of research just because of like grant funding and things like that being in limbo. I do have a client who works for a large university, and in her department, like more than a third of the attendings are just doing research. So she is kind of legitimately, I think, a little worried that if funding for research dries up, that it will be hard for her to maybe like have a solid employment situation where she is now. And she's like, if that happens, obviously she won't be able to do exactly what she's doing now. But like, we were able to walk through a lot of backup options. Like, okay, like, what does this look like if that happens? If that does happen, if this worst case scenario happens, what else can we do? So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think to start, we're just going to go through a few potential scenarios, for different types of institutions and employers. And obviously, it's all speculation. We can't predict the future, especially right now when I think things are more unpredictable than they usually are, even. But it's good to just walk through like what could happen so that we can make a backup plan. If this happens, this is what we can do. All of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and even if we knew exactly what changes were coming down the pipeline, it's still hard to predict how that would potentially play out for you specifically. It's like we could speculate, oh yeah, if the CDC funding goes away, what does that mean? It's like, well, we could have these fallout things that transpire, this domino effect that leads down this trail. But there might be other things we haven't even thought about that could be impacted, or maybe some of the things we thought might be impacted actually don't end up being impacted. So don't, run home and take any action after listening to this episode, but it's more just some conversation, some food for thought some planning ideas that we'll get to more at the end that could help prepare you better if some of these things might potentially play out and transpire. But at this point, a lot of it's just guesswork and up in the air. So wouldn't recommend taking any drastic actions right now other than maybe beefing up the savings account if possible. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so as with pretty much everything in financial planning, how does this affect you? It depends. Depends on your circumstances, your employment status, sources of revenue for your employer and you individually. Um, we'll kind of walk through some different types of employment settings or some of the things that have been brought up in news headlines and how that could impact certain segments of the medical world. So, first out of the gates, federal employees. If you work at a VA hospital, et cetera, sure, there's a chance you might lose your job if they are getting rid of people that are federal employees, or maybe they need doctors. They can't just get rid of all the doctors at the VA, but you might lose some of your staff support. They might get rid of some of the support staff, maybe nurses. I don't know. Some of you guys are on the battlefield and know better than I do what's transpiring at your specific institutions. And ironically, the Department of Government Efficiency is potentially making your employer less efficient, which just means takes longer to get things done, see patients, etc. If there's less people to do the jobs necessary, could mean if we're trying to find a positive here, that you potentially have more roles and responsibilities at your employer if they keep you, and therefore could potentially negotiate a pay raise. Again, none of this is guaranteed, of course, but there are opportunities. It's a free market, competitive labor market. If you could make more money elsewhere and they don't want to lose you, then you have an opportunity potentially to negotiate a better compensation package or better work-life balance, et cetera, for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have clients at the VA, and it seems like in a lot of places it's just hiring freezes across the board with the federal government. And yeah, I don't know also how that may affect pay increases and things like that too. So it never hurts to ask, but it could be a little more challenging to even get an increase in pay just because they're so tight. I don't know, with money
Yeah,
right
I think
now.
short
Yeah.
term, yes, hiring freezes across the board, even
Yeah.
at like regular hospitals, et cetera, until
Yeah.
they have a better
Mm-hmm.
idea of what's going to happen. Wouldn't be surprised if most employers have hiring freezes or pay uh, freezes on pay increases for at least the short term.
Yep. Another thing is, if your salary is paid by grant money, if it's canceled or not renewed, obviously your job description might change. Maybe you won't lose your job, but you don't have the grant money to do that research, that kind of thing. You may need to do more clinical work. And if that's not an option, you might not have a job at that employer, but you may need to look elsewhere. But, as a physician, you have skills. You have, you have the ability to go out there and get another doctor or another job, and it may not look exactly like you want it to look, but chances are it's out there. I think also geography will play into this. In smaller markets it may be a little more challenging. You might need to look farther out for jobs, which could be a little challenging. The one thing about grant money is that a lot of times the funding cycles are really long. So you may be writing grants right now that would be for money 2 years out. And like, depending on how much the federal government is able to freeze like existing grant money, it could be that some of this is delayed in terms of how it will impact people. So I think it's not just like, how is this going to play out over the next 3 months? It's how is it going to play out over the next 4 years or beyond. Uh, anyway.
It's yeah, kind of similar lines with grant money. Like if you're either employed directly by the CDC or NIH or somehow paid through their research and grant efforts, similar deal. You might not have that funding anymore. They might cut salaries, change job descriptions. The NIH has that student loan reimbursement program that's may not be available if they're decreasing funding. So for those of you that are doing research that can potentially qualify to get loan reimbursement through that program, it might not be an option. Um, just things to keep an eye on and be aware of.
Yep. I think when we're talking about other like federal government funding cuts, the other things are like Medicare and Medicaid. If reimbursements are like either reduced or even frozen, that could like reduce revenue that you're able to generate even in like a private practice. Like if you just can't bill as much, obviously that's going to affect you. But that can be a good opportunity to look at your business and try to make things a little bit more efficient. It could, and it really will depend on like what percentage of your clients and your patients are, Medicare patients or Medicaid patients, and what percentage have private insurance. So that's going to be like a big thing to consider, even with private employers and private practices.
Yeah, for some of you, it's basically all of your patients. For others, it's a rather small percentage. It kind of depends on your specialty, location, types of procedures you're doing, things of that nature. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but the Medicare reimbursement cuts, is it seems like ever since I've been alive, has been a thing, like a point of concern amongst healthcare providers. Um, and that's probably going to continue as long as Medicare remains underfunded, like I believe it currently is. So, let's see. This one is potentially a big one. Hospitals and possible universities losing their nonprofit status, but it might also not be that big of a deal. So, just kind of side note here, many hospitals and universities, when you look at their, you drive by, they're always, expanding, growing, doing cool new things. I mean, they're essentially real estate holding companies, and they're for-profit enterprises operating under the guise of a nonprofit entity. So I understand the logic behind removing their nonprofit status. But, if that happens, that, causes some serious financial implications for hospitals and universities. And what are the ramifications for doctors and healthcare providers? If they have to pay taxes on their quote unquote profits, that's a pretty large expense that they previously didn't have to pay. Currently they just, any extra money at the end of the year, they stuff it into a reserve account or an endowment fund, or bonus all the administrators. And if it's in the reserve or endowment fund, the money grows tax free currently under the current status, which is fantastic. Um, so kind of like we mentioned, if they do have to transition to for-profit entities, initially administrators would probably freeze salaries and hiring, and many, like we said, have maybe already done so until things play out. Um, in reality, with accounting and spending, it's pretty easy as a for-profit business to not show a profit on paper. You just spend money and then you don't have profits at the end of the day. So, in the short term, that may not impact operations too much. You just end up spending more instead of saving more. Long term, though, if you're not adding to that reserve account, not growing the endowment fund, having to pay taxes on the earnings in the endowment fund, that causes some real financial challenges, and it could slow the long-term growth prospects of both the hospital, university, and or your pay. Um, it's all again speculation and guesswork. I think one of the biggest things in the short term that could impact many of you is if your employer loses their nonprofit status, you're no longer eligible for public service loan forgiveness at that employer. So if you haven't um, reached your 120 payment mark yet, or you're still a ways away from it, that's something to keep an eye on. If you're It could be worth, if you're on the save plan, considering getting out of save and onto income-based repayment, just so you can restart making payments that will count towards loan forgiveness. Because right now, if you're on save, everything's frozen. You're not paying interest, but you're also not getting credited for payments. And if you still have a handful of years to go, you might want to get back on the payment train until this all pans out. Who knows how long it'll be. If you're pretty darn close to the 120 payment mark, it might make sense just to stay on save and then do the buyback option once you've reached 120 months of employment, or you can just pay a lump sum for all the months it was in deferment or forbearance and then get your loans forgiven at that point. But yeah, that's probably the biggest thing in the short term: hiring freezes and PSLF, and pay raise increases that could be impacting you. Long term, though, who knows?
Yeah. Corey, do you know the mechanism? Like, how would they do that? like change nonprofit status? Like that's all managed by the IRS, right?
Yeah, I don't know the mechanism. I'm not an expert
Yeah.
on government and the rules required. I mean,
I'm always just like, how
right
would they even
now,
do that? Like that's
well, the simple answer is Trump just signs an executive order that says hospitals are no longer considered nonprofits and tells the IRS what to do. And if the IRS disagrees, he fires whoever's in charge at the
or and
IRS.
then someone sues and it goes to the courts and like blah blah blah
Yeah.
blah 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 blah. But
Basically,
yeah,
all this stuff is going to be tied up in lawsuits, and probably nothing immediately is going to happen.
is that something that they have said like we want to do this? This is on our agenda. It's happening tomorrow, or is it one of those like
I don't
maybe
know.
things?
I think a
No.
lot of this is maybe I don't pay
Yeah,
enough
so don't
attention.
freak out about it too much,
I,
everyone. Like,
yeah, I don't pay enough attention. I just know I've seen multiple times like one of the proposed action items is but
yeah,
is looking at the nonprofit status of hospitals and looking at potentially taxing endowment funds because like
got it.
for some of these Ivy League schools that have $50 billion or more in an endowment fund and they don't pay any taxes on the investment earnings and they're charging
Hmm.
100 grand a year for kids to go to school there. Like, come on, this is a for-profit business.
Yeah. It's so hard to like, how do you differentiate between that and like, an in-state public university? Like, because it's not the same thing, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm off
But
track.
yeah, it's so again, I can see both sides of the argument, not saying
Yeah.
one is right or wrong, not saying it's fair.
Hmm.
Um, I understand why they might be looking at it.
Yep.
Whether or not they can just change it, I have no
Or
idea.
even will try, like
Or even
whether
we'll
it
try.
become, yeah, whether it moves up the agenda list and even becomes a thing. But
Yeah,
yeah.
who knows?
Okay. Okay. So again, all of this is very short-term speculation or speculation for the next couple 4 years, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, this is President Trump's second term. So, he's supposed to be done after this. We'll see how that goes because obviously he said some things to the contrary, implying that he may want to seek a third term. And we'll see. Yeah, that'll be fun if he tries to do that. But I don't think, large employers who are financially stable are going to completely overhaul their operations. If this is the next 2 to 4 years kind of thing, like it's really hard to do these large swings between these policies and then those policies with the next administration. Like that's very, very, very challenging, especially if people lose their jobs and then you have to rehire. It's incredibly expensive to do that. So like those operational costs will be really challenging for these large institutions if some of that ends up happening. But again, like we don't really know what's going to happen. I do think that like because it's so hard and expensive to rehire people, like firing people is not going to be the first solution to problems. Like it's just not the first thing that you go to. So like the situation at your employer better than we do about whether like maybe you should be worried about your job or not. But I think that brings us to the next thing, which is like if we are worried about job security in general, just because we're like, okay, my job is in this situation, I'm a little bit worried about it. There are some things that we can do to just feel more secure.
And
And
not just job security, but also maybe
yeah,
income stability. Like you
yeah,
might
that's
fear
true
your
too.
income will be less than it is currently. And how does
Yep.
that impact you?
Yep. I think with financial planning, like so much of it is about what is your backup plan? What is your backup plan? Like if you can't work, disability insurance, maybe like if we have an injury, like that can be your backup plan. If you lose a job, like a lot of that backup plan is something that hopefully we have thought about ahead of time. So it's like, what would be the next job that I could potentially look for? Are there other job opportunities where I live? Would I have to look outside of where I live? Would I need to potentially move? Like, if I really wanted to stay where I am right now, could I do a different kind of job to have enough income so that I can stay here at least, for the next year or two until maybe I can find another job that's a better fit and kind of like think through some of those scenarios. And that really is just, giving it some thought. Like, what could this really look like? Probably the most important thing when we're thinking about just short-term stability for our financial plan is emergency reserves, which we've talked about a few times. It feels boring, so we don't talk about it a lot, but it's so important. Like you should have some adequate money set aside in checking or savings or like a money market, something like that, where you can live for a few months without money, without income. And hopefully it's not in investments because investments can go up and down just like they have the last few months or last couple months. So we just want to have some cash set aside that is very stable and that could get us by for a little bit. The other thing is that hopefully you're living well within your means. If you're living well within your means, you're not spending every dollar that's coming in, you're doing a good job of like saving and things like that. That means that you've got some wiggle room if your income does decrease. And you also have some wiggle room if you're not able to work for a while, because like your emergency reserves will just go farther if you don't need every dollar that you're earning. So, a lot of times with our emergency reserves, we talk about having like 3 to 6 months of the basics, like in savings, like paying your bills, eating some food, doing all the stuff that you really need to do. Like if you're really worried about this, let's make sure it's at least 6 months. Like let's have 6 months of reserves set aside. And then again, let's try to live be like below our means so that if we need to, we can pause brokerage account contributions. Like there's all these things that you can do to kind of like have a little extra money just not going out. Like if we're living well below our means and we're saving into a 529 plan and a brokerage account and all of these things, like we're setting money aside for our goals, in an emergency, we just hit pause on those things. It doesn't mean that we're not going to do it forever, but we have like some extra like resources by just not saving a little bit for a while, which can be really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Long-term plans could easily be adjusted if need be. You could pause brokerage contributions, college savings contributions, etc. If you lose your job temporarily at work, you're not saving into the 403b or 401k at work
Yep.
anymore. So there's, an expense that's no longer there. Probably not commuting either. So save a
Mm-hmm.
little bit on gas money and car maintenance. But sometimes just thinking through these worst case scenarios makes you feel a little bit better. Okay, if this stuff happens, what are we going to do? It's kind of like disaster preparedness. If an earthquake or a tornado or a hurricane happens, what's the plan? Where are you going? Who are you staying with? Where are you staying? Like, who do you call? Etc. Talk that through with your kids. Like, hey, you're at school, earthquake, tornado, whatever. Are you going to grandma and grandpa's house? Are you going to a friend's house? Like, what's the plan here? If you can't get a hold of us, cell towers are down, etc. Where are we meeting? So, kind of thinking through all those things ahead of time and having a plan in place so that you have a little bit more comfort knowing what to do rather than just panicking and running around like a chicken with your head cut off when it actually does come about. Um, I mean, losing a job, yeah, pretty close to worst case scenario. But if you're somewhat prepared, you live below your means, you have a healthy emergency fund, that's what financial planning is all about. One of our favorite quotes from a mentor of ours is your financial plan should be a source of comfort and stability rather than a source of worry and stress. So the more you can get to that comfort and stability with your finances, the better off you'll be able to handle adversity. Now,
Yeah.
one of my other favorite quotes is risk is what you don't see coming. So you can think through all these potential scenarios and what you would do. It's the thing you haven't thought of that's gonna, rock the boat a bit. So, we can only be so prepared. Um, but yeah, it doesn't hurt to be over prepared. It doesn't hurt to think through these things. And I think in the long run, you guys should be just fine.
Yeah. Agree. I think long run, you're doctors. You have some very, very, very useful skills. And I think that that is like bottom line at this point. But, some short term instability and things like that can be very disconcerting and just make you feel uncomfortable. But
Regardless of what happens on a regulatory level or tax status level, grant money level, like there's a lot of people in this country that get sick, that get injured, that need to be seen by a doctor. Like us Americans, we love our healthcare. We use a lot of healthcare compared to most other nations. So it's not
yeah,
like
we
the
eat a lot of crappy
demand.
food.
Yeah, it's not like the demand for your services is going away. So it might provide opportunities if there's a lack of federal resources. Maybe some private companies or practices will be able to fill the void and grow their operations, and there's employment opportunities there. Now, like Rachelle said, if you're, you know, knees deep into the research and like you don't do any clinical work, you don't have any interest in seeing patients, you just want to do research or academic related stuff, like there, yeah, your job might have to change temporarily, but like we said, there's skills that you have that you could utilize to still work and earn an income while things get sorted out. So,
Yeah. Good luck, everyone. I hope you're not feeling too stressed.
yeah, let us know if you have any questions. See you next time.